There's a smell to a funeral home that you can't find anywhere else. It's not a bad smell. It's a mix of lily, carnations, formaldehyde, and a deep, polished wood scent that seems to have soaked into the very bones of the building. It's the smell of quiet dignity, of finality. I've worked at Abernathy & Sons for 15 years now, and that smell is more familiar to me than my own perfume. My name is Sarah, and I'm a mortician. An embalmer, to be specific. Most people get a little weird when I tell them what I do. They imagine some kind of ghoulish, basement-dwelling creature. But the reality is far less dramatic. My job is to give families one last, peaceful memory of the person they loved. It's a science, yes, but it's also an art. My canvas is just different. Most days are routine. The paperwork, the phone calls with grieving families, the quiet, methodical work in the prep room. You develop a professional detachment. You have to, or the sorrow of it all would swallow you whole. But every now and then, a case comes through that pierces that veil. One that reminds you that every person who lays on my steel table was once a life, a story. Eleanor Vance was one of those cases. If you lived in our small town, you knew Eleanor Vance. She was 88 pounds of pure sweetness. She'd been the town librarian for 40 years, the one who always had a secret smile and a peppermint candy for the kids. Even after she retired, she was everywhere volunteering at the church bake sales, reading to children at the hospital, tending to the public rose garden in the town square. She was the kind of person you just assumed would live forever, a permanent, gentle fixture of the community. So when we got the call that she had passed, a collective sigh of sadness went through the town. The story was a peaceful one, the kind you'd wish for anyone. Her grandson found her in her favorite armchair, a book open in her lap, a half-empty cup of chamomile tea on the table beside her. She had simply gone to sleep. The doctor signed the death certificate without a second thought. Natural causes, cardiac arrest in her sleep. A peaceful end to a peaceful life. Her family was devastated, of course, but they took great comfort in knowing she hadn't suffered. It was my job to prepare her for her viewing. Her family had requested an open casket. They wanted everyone to be able to say a proper goodbye. I remember wheeling her into the prep room. She was so frail, a tiny bird of a woman. As I began my work, I followed the same steps I always do. It's a ritual, a process that brings order to the chaos of death. I was gentle, respectful. This was Mrs. Vance, after all, the woman who taught me to love books. Everything was normal, everything was routine, until I got to her hands. It's a small but important detail, making sure the hands look relaxed and natural, the fingernails clean and neat. I was carefully cleaning under her nails when I first saw it. It was almost nothing. Not a bruise, not a cut. It was a series of tiny, dark pinpricks deep under the nail bed of her right ring finger. Stippling, almost. Like the tiniest blood vessels had burst from some incredible, focused pressure. I paused, my cleaning tool hovering over her delicate skin. I'd never seen anything quite like it. I moved to her other hand and found the same thing under two of her other fingernails. Faint, dark, stippled bruises that you would never notice unless you were looking for them. My professional detachment began to crumble, replaced by a cold, creeping unease. Old skin bruises easily, yes, but this wasn't a surface bruise. This was deep. This looked violent. I went to find my boss, Mr. Abernathy. He's an old-school funeral director, a man who believes in tradition, dignity, and not making waves. I showed him the marks. He peered at them through his bifocals, his face impassive. "It's post-mortem lividity, Sarah," he said, his voice calm and dismissive. Or maybe she knocked her hands on something. She was 88. Old skin is like tissue paper. "No," I insisted. my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. This isn't lividity. This looks like someone held her hands down, hard. He straightened up and gave me a look I knew all too well. It was the don't go looking for trouble look. The death certificate is signed by Dr. Miller. Natural causes. The family is at peace. They believe she died peacefully. Are you going to be the one to take that away from them based on a few microscopic specks? Let it go. Finish your work. Make her look beautiful. I knew he was right from a certain point of view. My job wasn't to be a detective. It was to comfort the living. But I couldn't shake it. I finished my work, and Mrs. Vance did look beautiful. She looked like she was sleeping. But every time I looked at her hands, folded so peacefully over her chest, I felt a knot of ice in my stomach. I had hidden the truth under a careful application of cosmetic wax and opaque nail polish. For days, I tried to forget it. The funeral was lovely. The whole town came out. People cried, they shared stories, they celebrated her life. Her grandson gave a eulogy that didn't leave a dry eye in the house. And all I could think about were the marks I'd covered up. A few weeks later, I was doing inventory in our old filing room, a dusty archive of decades of goodbyes. My hand brushed against a cardboard box labeled with cases from my first year at the home, a decade and a half ago. And then a memory surfaced, cold and sharp. A John Doe, a homeless man they'd found under the Harrison Street Bridge in the dead of winter. The official cause of death was exposure. I remember being nervous. I remember the man's hands, weathered and calloused. And I remember seeing the same strange stippled bruises under his fingernails. At the time, I was too green, too intimidated to say anything. I assumed it was just another grim aspect of a hard life. My heart started hammering. It couldn't be a coincidence. I tore through the box until I found the file. The name on the tab just read, John Doe, M45. I flipped it open, and there they were. The crime scene photos. A close-up of the man's hands. And under his nails, the same pattern. The exact same signature of violence. I felt like I was going to be sick. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a pattern. I spent the rest of that night, and many nights after, diving into a rabbit hole I knew I shouldn't. I used my professional access to discreetly look up the records of other deaths in the county. I focused on the elderly, the vulnerable, the forgotten people whose deaths wouldn't raise any eyebrows. People who were cremated or had closed casket services. I found another one. An elderly man in a low-income nursing home. Died of a massive coronary event. His file mentioned unusual discoloration of the extremities, but it was dismissed as a circulatory issue. Then another, a woman with advanced Alzheimer's who aspirated in her sleep. No autopsy. I started to piece together a horrifying picture. Someone was preying on the weakest members of our community. An angel of death making murders look like natural causes. The method was brilliant in its cruelty. They would suffocate their victims with a pillow, using their other hand to pin their victims' hands down to stop them from flailing. The only evidence of the struggle, the only sign of the victim's desperate last fight for life, was hidden in the one place no one would ever think to look. But who? It had to be someone with access. A healthcare worker? A volunteer? I went back to Eleanor Vance's file. I looked through the condolence records, the visitor logs her family had provided. My eyes scanned the list of names. And then I saw it. A name that appeared several times a week in her visitor log at her home. A volunteer from her church who brought her groceries. A man known for his charity work, especially with the homeless population. A man who is hailed as a local saint. The same man who had, as a favor to the grieving family, come to our funeral home to drop off her favorite dress for the viewing. His name was David, As his name burned itself into my brain, I heard the soft chime of the bell on the funeral home's back entrance. I was working late, alone in the building. My blood ran cold. I glanced up at the small black and white security monitor on my desk. Standing on the back step, illuminated by the dim porch light, was David. He was holding a small bakery box and smiling his kind, gentle smile. He raised a hand and waved at the camera, directly at me. He knew I was there. He knew I was alone. And in that moment, I knew with absolute, gut-wrenching certainty that he knew what I had found. The sweet, helpful man from church wasn't just dropping off pastries. He knew I had uncovered his secret, and he had come to make sure it was buried once and for all. You do this job long enough, you start to see the dead as paperwork. That sounds harsh, I know, but it's a coping mechanism. My name's Frank. I work the night shift at the county morgue. It's not a funeral home. There are no grieving families here, no soft music. Just me, the hum of the refrigeration units, and the silent arrivals from whatever sad, lonely end they met out on the streets. Overdoses, accidents, suicides. They all end up on my table. After a while, you get jaded. You have to. You stop seeing them as people and start seeing them as cases. Case number 734. Male, approximate age 45. Cause of death, pending. So when they wheeled in the John Doe from the Crestwood Motel, it was just another Tuesday night. The report was thin. Found by a cleaning lady in room 217. Needle in his arm, paraphernalia on the nightstand. A classic, sad, open and shut overdose. Another ghost in the machine. My job was simple. Process him, catalog his effects, and put him in cold storage until he was either identified or sent to the city crematorium. I got to work. He was unremarkable. Mid-40s, like the report said. Worn-out clothes, track marks on his arms. Just another life chewed up and spit out by the city. I began the process of cataloging his personal effects. It was the usual sad collection. A half-empty pack of cigarettes, a crumpled $5 bill, a book of matches. But then I found two things in the small watch pocket of his jeans that were out of place. The first was a key. It was old, made of heavy brass, with the number 42 stamped into its head. It wasn't a car key or a house key. It looked like a key for an old locker. The second was a tiny piece of paper, folded into a perfect small square. I carefully unfolded it. Written on it in neat, precise handwriting was a series of numbers. 0814 11250302. I stared at them for a long time. It was probably nothing. A locker combination, a phone number, a drug dealer's code. 99 times out of 100, I would have just sealed them in the evidence bag and forgotten about them. But that night, I don't know. Maybe it was the boredom, the endless, sterile silence of the morgue. That little piece of paper felt like a riddle, a whisper from a man who had no other voice. I couldn't let it go. For the rest of my shift, I kept looking at those numbers. 0814 1125 0302. They weren't random. The spacing was deliberate. I typed them into the computer, looking for any kind of significance. Nothing. Then it hit me. They were dates. 8 to 14, August 14th, 11 to 25, November 25th, 0302, March 2nd on a hunch. I opened a web browser and searched the local news archives for August 14th from a few years back. My breath caught in my throat. A 19-year-old college student, Sarah Jenkins, had vanished while jogging in a local park. They found her car, but she was never seen again. My hands were shaking slightly as I typed in the next date, November 25th. A young father, Mark Chun, disappeared on his way home from work. His car was found abandoned on the side of the highway. No signs of a struggle. He was just gone. With a feeling of cold dread, I searched the last date, March 2nd last year. A 16-year-old girl, Emily Rose, vanished from a bus stop. 3 dates, 3 missing people, 3 cases that had gone cold. This John Doe wasn't just a junkie. He was something else entirely. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything but the key. Key number 42. It had to be a locker. I took my day off and started my search. I went to the bus station downtown. The rows of gray metal lockers looked ancient. I walked down the aisles, my heart pounding a nervous rhythm. 38, 40, and there it was. Locker 42. It was scarred and dented, but the lock looked functional. I slid the brass key into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. The inside of the locker was nearly empty. It smelled of dust and rust. There was just one item inside, a thick, black, spiral-bound scrapbook. I pulled it out and carried it to a bench, my hands trembling. I opened it. The first few pages were filled with newspaper clippings, meticulously cut out and pasted onto the black paper. The headline of the first one read, "Community Searches for Missing Student." It was Sarah Jenkins. The next section was for Mark Chun. The third, for Emily Rose. He had been following them, collecting the stories of their disappearances like trophies. I felt a wave of nausea. I was holding a serial killer's diary. I almost closed it. I almost took it straight to the police. But a morbid curiosity, a need to see the whole ugly truth, kept my fingers turning the pages. The second half of the book was different. There were no more clippings. There were photographs. Candid, long-lens photographs. A woman getting coffee. A man walking his dog. A child on the swings at a playground. Dozens of them. They were all stalker photos, capturing random people in their most mundane, unguarded moments. It was a gallery of potential victims. My throat was dry. I turned to the last section of the book, the final 10 pages. And that's when my world tilted on its axis. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. The photos on these pages were of me. There I was, locking the door to the morgue at the end of my shift. There I was, in the fluorescent lighting of the produce aisle at the grocery store. There I was, sitting on my own front porch, drinking a beer, my head tilted back, completely oblivious. There was even one photo, dark and grainy, taken through my bedroom window while I was asleep. The man on my table? The John Doe from room 217. He wasn't just a killer. He had been hunting me. I was next. That overdose in the motel room wasn't just a sad end to a junkie's life. It was a stupid, clumsy mistake that had, by sheer dumb luck, saved my life. I slammed the book shut and ran. I drove back to the morgue, the scrapbook sitting on the passenger seat like a venomous snake. I looked at the body on the table, no longer just a case number, but a monster who had been watching my every move. I felt a strange mix of terror and relief. It was over. He was dead. And then my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. There was no message, just an image attached. I opened it. It was a photo, taken just seconds ago. It showed the back of my own head, my shoulders slumped as I stood staring down at the John Doe's body on the table. The picture had been taken from the dark, shadowy corner of the morgue. My heart stopped. I spun around, but the room was empty. Then, a second text came through from the same number. 5 words that made the terror of the scrapbook feel like a pleasant memory. 5 words that told me this wasn't over. It was just beginning. It said, "You have his book. I'll wait outside." My father always said a funeral home is a place for the living, not the dead. He ran this place, the Briarwood Funeral Home, for 40 years. It was his life's work. When he passed, he left it to me. His only child, Clara. I tried my best to honor his legacy, but the truth is, the business was dying. Big corporate funeral chains were moving in, undercutting us at every turn. I was drowning in debt, just weeks away from having to sell the place that had been in my family for 3 generations. I was desperate, and that's when the lawyer called. The call was about Alistair Blackwood. If you lived in this town, you knew the name, but you didn't know the man. He was a legend, a boogeyman. He'd inherited a vast fortune decades ago and had lived as a complete recluse in his crumbling Gothic mansion on the hill overlooking the town. No one had seen him in at least 30 years. He was more myth than man. And now he was dead. The lawyer, a dry, humorless man named Mr. Finch, explained the situation. Mr. Blackwood had died, and his will was unconventional. He had no family, no friends. And in his will, he had named my small, struggling funeral home as the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. The number Mr. Finch quoted was staggering. It wasn't just enough to save the business. It was life-altering, generational wealth. I was speechless. It felt like a dream. But then came the catch. Mr. Finch called it the beneficiary's clause. It was a strange, ironclad condition. To receive the inheritance, I, and only I, had to personally handle Mr. Blackwood's remains. I had to perform the embalming completely alone. No assistance, no security cameras, which I was legally required to turn off, no witnesses of any kind. And I had to follow a set of personal instructions he had left to the absolute letter. The instructions were in a sealed, wax-stamped envelope that Mr. Finch handed me. Any deviation, he warned, and the entire inheritance would be forfeited. It was bizarre, but I figured he was just a rich eccentric who wanted his privacy, even in death. I was so desperate for the money, I would have agreed to almost anything. That night, they delivered his body. I waited until my staff had gone home, locked the doors, and shut off the security cameras, the little red lights winking out one by one, leaving me in an unnerving silence. I wheeled Mr. Blackwood into the prep room. He was emaciated, a withered husk of a man with long, white hair and fingernails that had curled into yellowed talons. I broke the wax seal on the envelope. The instructions inside were written on thick, yellowed parchment in an elegant, spidery script. They were more unsettling than I could have imagined. First, I was forbidden from using my standard embalming fluids. Instead, I was to use a set of 5 unlabeled, cork-stoppered glass bottles he had provided. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, and incredibly viscous. When I opened the first bottle, a strange, cloyingly sweet and metallic smell filled the room. The scent of old roses and fresh copper. Next, the instructions dictated I was to place small silver charms on his body. They were in a velvet pouch. Each was etched with a strange, star-like symbol. One on each eye, one on his tongue, one in the palm of each hand. The cold metal felt wrong against his skin. Finally, the last step. I had to lean close to his ear and whisper a series of phrases written on the parchment. They were in a language I didn't recognize, guttural and strange. The words felt alien in my mouth, like speaking them was a violation of some unspoken rule. The entire process took hours. It didn't feel like embalming. It felt like a ritual, a dark, strange ceremony. When I was finished, I felt physically and emotionally drained and deeply unnerved. But I had done it. The next morning, as promised, the money was in my account. I saved my family's funeral home. I was rich. And for a few weeks, my life was perfect. Then, the strange thing started. It was small at first. I'd be at home, in my apartment across town, and I'd suddenly smell it. That sweet, coppery smell of the fluid I'd used on Blackwood. It would linger for a moment, and then vanish. Then came the sounds. Faint whispers at the edge of hearing, like the skittering of dry leaves across a wooden floor, even when all the windows were shut. It escalated. One evening, I was driving home, and my car radio, which was off, suddenly crackled to life, blasting the aria from Don Giovanni, an opera I despise. I found out later it had been Alistair Blackwood's favorite. I started seeing things too. A tall, thin shadow moving in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look. One morning, I woke up with a jolt. Sitting on my bedside table, glinting in the morning light, was one of the silver charms, the one I had placed on his tongue. The terror was no longer something I could ignore. I had, out of a morbid sense of self-preservation, kept a tiny vial of the fluid from that night. I took it to a friend who worked as a chemist at the local university, telling him it was a strange antique fluid I'd found. I begged him to analyze it. The results came back a week later. My friend was pale, his hands shaking as he handed me the report. The fluid wasn't a preservative, not in any chemical sense. It was a bizarre cocktail of organic compounds, belladonna, trace amounts of human blood plasma, and extracts from several rare, highly psychotropic plants from the Amazon basin. He said the mixture was chemically inert for preservation, but matched descriptions he'd found in obscure, historical texts on alchemy and occult rituals. The texts claimed this specific formula wasn't meant to preserve a body. It was meant to create a spiritual anchor, a vessel. The truth hit me with the force of a physical blow. I stumbled back to my apartment, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The claws, the solitude, the ritual. Alistair Blackwood wasn't just an eccentric. He was a student of the dark arts. He hadn't wanted to be preserved for the afterlife. He had been terrified of it, of whatever judgment awaited him. He had found a way to cheat death. The ritual wasn't for his body. It was for his soul. And the first, in my desperation, had been his willing accomplice. I had performed the rite that tethered his malevolent spirit to me. The inheritance wasn't a gift. It was payment. Payment for a new home. My home. My body. That night, as the phantom sound of the opera swelled from my silent living room, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, my reflection pale and terrified in the dim light. I stared into my own eyes, and for a horrifying, gut-wrenching second, my reflection changed. It was no longer my face looking back at me. It was the gaunt, skeletal face of Alistair Blackwood. And he was smiling. He wasn't just haunting me. He was moving in. And that's all for tonight. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like us. The ones who might even live right next door. If these stories serve as a good reminder to trust your instincts, then show your support and like and subscribe. Hitting that bell means you'll get a warning before the next nightmare begins. Sleep well, if you can.